Thanks so much for having me, and thank you for the introduction. It's a pleasure to join you guys, and thank you everyone for joining me this evening. Hopefully nobody falls asleep during this. So today I'm going to talk about local subdermal plexus flaps. So I'll go over kind of a brief overview of wounds and flaps in general, and then focus a lot more on subdermal plexus flaps. Go over a few kind of pitfalls and tips as we go along the way, and then focus on specific types and examples. So wound closure in general can be difficult when there's a lack of skin due to trauma or excision. So shearing wounds, burns, things like that, or when we've removed masses, tumors, etc. So sometimes we have second intention healing as an option, and sometimes it's not a really viable option. So then we need to figure out how to move skin around to our advantage. And we have several different ways that we can move skin around. One is by doing grafts. The other is axial pattern flaps, and then the third is local subdermal plexus flaps. And that's what I'm going to focus on, because it's probably the easiest way to kind of get into reconstructive surgery options, and should easily be doable for anyone who does any routine surgery. So a subdermal plexus flap and how it differs from an axial pattern flap. Subdermal plexus flap has no direct cutaneous artery. The vascular supply comes from the subdermal vascular plexus, and so it's a little bit less consistent. The advantage is these can be done anywhere on the body. With an axial pattern flap, you're limited by location because they have very specific anatomical borders, and you require a direct cutaneous artery and vein. The advantage is it tends to be a very consistent blood supply. So as far as subdermal plexus flap go, the length to width ratio of 2:1 is generally safe, and that's twice the length as the width that you're dealing with. You can venture into the land of 3:1, but there is a much greater risk of distal necrosis, and greater than that, you're pretty much going to guarantee to necrose the end of that flap. A broad base is better. Composite flaps do help as well, so if you can include underlying muscles such as the cutaneous trunci or the platysma, depending on where you're at on the body, that helps as well. One of the big things about this is you want to suture these only at the edges. Any sutures that you place in the middle kind of risk compromising some of that blood supply. So all of those branches from the subdermal plexus flap. If you're worried about seroma formation and dead space, you can use a drain or just a bandage if indicated or as needed to try to prevent these from forming. So probably the simplest one is a single pedicle advancement flap. So the skin is moved straight into the defect, and there's no change in the plane of the pedicle. So you have your defect here, and you extend the incisions to create a skin flap. You can sometimes excise these little triangles to try to avoid dog ears. I would say at the beginning, don't worry too much about dog ears. It's more of a cosmetic issue than anything else. And then that skin gets pulled over top. So here is an example of that. So this was a Corgi that had a wound kind of over his caudal back, just above where his tail is. So skin couldn't really be moved from caudally at all because that would have put tension on his anus, and that's one thing that we don't want to do is try to compromise vital structures in the area. So this was at surgery. So this is an idea of his wound and how much skin is clipped and prepped. And so basically extending from that wound. It's just extended cranially. So the head of the dog is at the top. And then some blunt and sharp dissection are used to kind of elevate that skin flap. And then it's pulled caudally to close up that defect. So we're pretty lucky in dogs and cats in our domestic species that they tend to have a lot more redundant skin, and so we can get a lot of stretch from them in this way. And you can see in this case a drain was placed that was exited out here to try to prevent seroma formation under the flap while it was healing. And so this is what he looks like at suture removal. And so, this area is a little bit darker. This is pigmentation in the skin itself because that area had been shaved while the wound was being managed. So that's not discoloration from the tissue looking like it's starting to die. And this is what he looked like months later. So nice full thickness skin coverage. You can see the surgery lines, but really minimal scarring. And probably if you didn't know what had happened to him, you would just assume that it was just a normal shift in follicles. So an H-plasty is basically composed of two single pedicle advancement flaps on opposite sides. So very same principle that we had. There's a wound in the middle. This time we're performing one single pedicle advancement flap on each side, pulling them together, and they meet in the middle. So the length of these should equal the width of the defect to minimize tension. So and by that we mean, so the length of this flap should at least equal this width of the defect. So that it minimizes that tension in the middle. So you don't want to make a flap that's shorter, in other words. So this is an example of a Rottweiler who had a large wound on the side, flank area, that had been managed with a tie-over bandage. You can see where the sutures were for the tie-over bandage. And then once the wound started to look good, closure was planned, and there seemed to be enough skin that was able, or that wanted to be moved around, that it could be closed by an H-plasty. So this is the planning of that, and so it was extended dorsally and ventrally, and then these two flaps were sutured up in the middle, and then the sides were sutured up secondarily. And that's typically what I'll do, is I'll kind of get that furthest edge of the flaps sutured into place first, and then do the sides with less tension. So a transposition flap is usually rectangular in shape, and it's rotated into the defect. Most are rotated in at about 90 degrees, and the best thing to do with these ones is to leave the dog ears, because a lot of times the dog ears will form near the base of the flap, and resecting them can affect that vascular supply to the flap itself. So key points for transposition flaps. When you're measuring these out, if you number or label all of the corners with a letter, the distance from the base of the flap that's furthest from the defect to the corner opposite needs to be the same as the distance from that base of the flap to the furthest end of the defect. So in effect, this flap is larger than the defect itself, but you need that length to be able to move the skin over to cover the defect without having any tension.